Hey guys, it's Nikki. So before we get started with today's episode, I just want to give you all a heads up. This is going to be the last episode for a little while. I will be off grid for the month of August. We will be backpacking in Vermont, doing the long trail, the whole thing. So I won't be around, so I won't be able to upload some podcasts for a little bit. I apologize for the slight delay, but I will be back. Fear not. Feel free to go back and listen to some of my past episodes to get your fix on all things grief-related, or take a break, work on yourself, have a little self-care day. Thank you so much. Hello, and welcome to Good Grief, the podcast dedicated to demystifying and destigmatizing grief with compassion and sometimes humor. I'm Nikki. I'm an end-of-life doula and a grief coach in Columbus, Ohio. And today, I have feelings. We're going to be discussing something that's been trending, I guess you could say, in the psychotherapy worlds and in grief circles as well. And I read a really cool article from Psychotherapy Networker that I will link, obviously, in the description. But I've been reading a lot of articles on this very topic, and this article specifically kind of struck a chord with me, and I wanted to read through some of it with you and kind of give you my thoughts. And I, just a pre-warning, I definitely have opinions on this matter, and I will be discussing them. So if hearing my opinions on something might upset you, then I don't know why you're listening to this podcast to begin with, because I feel like I share my opinions a lot on things. So the subject we're going to be discussing, I almost said disgusting, is the new diagnostic addition to the DSM regarding grief. So basically, grief has now been added to the DSM as a psychological condition. That's like the most layman's terms way I can think of putting that. It can now be a diagnosable event and treated as any other diagnosable mental illness. So here's kind of the two sides of this coin. On one side, we now have grief is now considered, a diagnosable, prolonged grief, I should say, is now a diagnosable condition. And with that can be treated as such, which means some people who may not have been able to take advantage of psychotherapy because of insurance purposes can now, that's now billable to insurance because it's now a diagnosable condition. So you can see a psychotherapist, a therapist, psychologist, psychiatrist, counselor, whatever, and they can, quote, diagnose you with this, and then they can treat you, and that can be billed towards insurance, possibly. And also, this could play a role in bereavement leave through employers, because currently in most places, and I can't verify this, I don't work in HR or anything like that, but in most places I've been, they give you 3 days bereavement leave. That's it. So if my husband, love of my life, best friend dies, I can take 3 whopping days off work, and then I better get my ass back. Or I have to use my own personal paid time off. So that could also increase bereavement leave, right? This could be considered more of a, FMLA type leave situation. So that's one side of the coin. In the other side of that, it's now, because it's a diagnosis, because it's now a diagnosable condition, it kind of puts a timestamp on this, and it's hard to it's hard to explain this without my opinion coming out. It's basically saying this is now a thing that you can be treated for and get over. And what have I been telling you guys for the past 10 episodes? You don't get over your grief. It's now a part of your life, right? And with this becoming a diagnosable condition, the idea behind that, or any other diagnosable condition, is to treat it and get rid of it, right? So what it's saying is this is now a thing, then it's bad and we need to get rid of it, right? And how many times have I told you grief isn't bad? It's just a part of your life now, and it's who you are. Okay, so that's the long and short of it. I tried really hard to remain objective in explaining that, and I think I did a terrible job, so I'm very sorry. So in this article, they interviewed a few different people on what prolonged grief is, if it's a mental disorder or just a natural process. I think we all know where I stand on that. And it's pretty much, I would say almost all of the things I've read from psychiatrists, psychologists, anybody who works with grief has agreed that this is kind of not a good thing for the reasons I've expressed. So anyway, they interviewed grief and trauma experts. The people they interviewed are David Kessler, Donna Sherman, and Frank Anderson. And like I said, I'm going to link this article so you can go in and look at all the references too, and look at, these three individuals and their history, things like that. But they've all worked as therapists in one way or another, or researchers in the grief field. So I'll just kind of read through some of the stuff in this article that really kind of caught me. First of all, David Kessler said, "I'm afraid this new diagnosis is perpetuating an idea that we need to help people, quote, get over it." And that's kind of exactly what I've been saying too, is like this. And he goes on to say that isn't what grief professionals or people in grief want to do. We don't get over our loved ones. They aren't colds or flus. And that's, like I said, that's kind of what I've been saying is grief is not something you get over. In my opinion, and I've said this before, and he says this too, there's a quote somewhere in this article that grief is love. It's a love letter. It's an expression of love, because the fact that you're grieving is saying you loved somebody. So if you get over it, do you not love them anymore? Does that negate your relationship with that person? The grief is your love for that person. So basically you're saying love is something you need to get rid of, right? That's at least, yeah, anyway. I'm trying, you guys. So, and Donna Sherman goes on to say, all the symptoms the DSM lists are normal responses to grief. True. Some people may need professional support to deal with them, but there are ways to help people without having to pathologize them. I'm afraid the diagnosis will be overused, stigmatize grief, and set us back in terms of understanding the lifelong impact of death. Whew. And I've talked a little bit about symptoms of grief and the responses, which can sometimes mimic depression and other mental illnesses. But she said exactly what I keep thinking. It's stigmatizing grief now. It's quoting it, not quoting it, but it's saying grief is bad. Get rid of it. So Frank Anderson, the third person they talked to, is a psychiatrist, and he has a background working with PTSD and trauma-related histories. But, grief can play into that too. His quote, the thing he said at the end of this first question was, as a psychiatrist, I find the idea of giving drugs for grief is concerning. There is not a lot of overlap between depression and grief, so the inclination some may have to quickly give an antidepressant because someone has this diagnosis worries me. In some circumstances, it might be warranted, but the greater risk to overdo treatment with medications for something that needs to be processed and worked through. And medication is, that's not something I'll ever really discuss because that's not part of what I do. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm a grief coach, and I'm an end-of-life doula, so I don't really have anything to do with any of that. I didn't go to medical school, so I can't really quote much on antidepressants and medications. But I do have to agree to a point that just giving somebody antidepressants because they're suffering grief, maybe it is warranted, and that is possible, especially if the person does have a history of other mental illnesses or depression. That could be warranted, but also just, I feel like there's kind of becoming a culture of just throwing drugs at people to make them go away. And this isn't just mental illness, but even other, physical illnesses. Well, just take this pill and go away so I don't have to deal with you anymore, instead of actually trying to figure out what the problem is and work through it. Again, sometimes drugs are absolutely necessary, but I'm also not a psychiatrist and I have no medical degree, so I really can't, I'm not an expert in that field. These are just my opinions, my thoughts. Donna Sherman went on expounding on that. Said they're even testing drugs like naltrexone, I'm not sure how that's pronounced, to treat grief as an addiction. just going to let that sink in for a minute. They're testing certain drugs to treat grief as an addiction. Ooh, so the concept of treating it as an addiction, I'm reading her quote exactly. The concept of treating it as an addiction is based on a study that Mary Frances O'Connor and her colleagues did called Craving Love. They showed 23 women photos of their mother or sister who had died of breast cancer, then measured their brain activity in an fMRI. They found the nucleus accumbens, I don't know the word, in the brains of 11 women who had been diagnosed with, quote, complicated grief, lit up and stayed lit up longer than those of the other women. The hypothesis is that people who have prolonged grief disorder are craving their loved ones due to the positive reinforcement provided by the memories of that loved one. In essence, they're addicted to the memory of the lost loved one. Very next up in the article was one of the other doctors piping in, said, Donna, I'm sorry, could you repeat the number of people in that study again? Because this stood out to me too. 23. It's being touted as a scientific study that undergirds this diagnosis and merits drug treatment. And I think that is really concerning. That was Donna Sherman's quote. I'm going to have to agree with that. They did a study on 23 people, and they're touting this as a scientific study. Now, I've never done full peer-reviewed scientific research before in all my histories of studies and everything. So even never having done peer-reviewed scientific research, I know you need more than 23 people to do that, okay? Because I've read a lot of scientific researches. In my studies to be a personal trainer, I've done so much reading and studying on personal training and the human body and things like that. Don't have a degree in it. But even the studies they're doing on fitness, wellness, and health, there's so much of it that has been thrown out because they only studied like a couple dozen people. You can't do that. You can't just study 23 people and say, well, this is all obviously a thing now. That's not how scientific study works, guys. Whew. Okay. All right. Sorry. I'm getting animated. So the interviewer is talking about, isn't this new diagnosis okay? It might open the door for more people to get professional help. And that is true. And possibly now they can get insurance coverage for treatment for grief. Isn't that a good thing, basically? And yes, but the idea of putting a timeline on a grief is a huge mistake for so many reasons. And this is me. This is nothing from the article. This is just thoughts I'm having right now. These are things I'm thinking. But if you go in for treatment for grief, you're grieving loss, you can't function, and you go in for treatment, and they're like, okay, I'm going to diagnose you with this. What's going to happen is they're going to say you have like 20 sessions, 10 sessions, 6 months to finish treatment. So if that 6 months goes by and you still aren't feeling better and this grief still hurts that bad, now what? You're a failure? You failed? You lost? Like, that's the way I'm viewing it. And that's the way insurance companies are going to view it too. It's like, well, you're not over it. Sorry, we gave you this amount of time to get over the loss of your person. Deal with it. Sorry. Shit out of luck now. You're on your own. Like, and I mean, depending on the type of loss, sometimes that, like, the first year of, especially if it's a traumatic or sudden loss, I mean, it could take a year or two for just the numbness and shock to wear off before you can even consider recognizing your grief and working with it. Right? You have to get through that initial period first before you can even think about working with your grief and learning to walk with it. You can't start to work on yourself and your grief if you haven't even recognized it yet, if you haven't even accepted it, because you're still in the shock phase. And that shock phase for some people can last a week, a month. It can last years. It can, like, I know I've had griefs in my past that I still am only barely starting to work on with myself, because it took me so long to get past the shock part of it. And to have somebody come in a week after they've lost a loved one and they're not ready, and then forcing them to be ready and work on something when they're not there yet, it's going to destroy everything down the line, and it's going to push that out further. Forcing somebody to work on something they're not ready to work on yet is only going to make matters worse. Again, these are all just my thoughts, my opinions. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a psychiatrist. And so one of the people they interviewed in this article, just a quote, I'll read this quote. It says, "While I think a diagnosis centered around the timeline of grief is a mistake, it's so important that clinicians be adequately reimbursed for providing services to those in grief." Right? I think we can agree to that. If you're providing a service, you should be compensated for it. He goes on to say, "I just wish the focus was on ongoing disruptions to the activities of our daily living rather than a given point in time." So you don't want to focus on, all right, in 6 months, you need to be done dealing with this grief. We need to focus on how it's affecting you and how you can work with it and how you can, integrate this grief into your life and work with it. Instead of saying, all right, got to get past it, done. And then Donna Sherman goes on to say after that, I love this, "The emphasis on timelines is so strange. Time doesn't heal all wounds, not if you don't attend to them. So the question becomes, how do we attend to them?" She goes on from there. But just her thought of time does not heal all wounds. How many times have I said that? You guys, you don't get over your grief, and you can't just put a timeline on it. And everybody's grief is different. I say that all the time too. You might be not over it, but you might be, now walking with your grief comfortably in 6 months after a loss. But for somebody else, it might be 6 years before they're comfortable with it. You can't put a timeline on this. There is a lovely quote right here that I have to read, because this is basically my job as a grief coach and what I do, also as an end-of-life doula. Quote, "It is not just our culture. Many therapists have a hard time sitting with pain and loss, especially our own. So I ask, can we look inside and deal with the pain that we've experienced in our lives? Can we sit with somebody and allow them to be with the pain they're experiencing? Instead of diagnosing and stopping it, can we allow them to feel the sorrow that's rooted in the loss of love and connection?" Whew. And that's basically what I do as a grief coach. I'm not a therapist. I don't have that background. I'm allowing somebody to feel their pain and experience it and help guide them in the direction that they want to go in. I can get into a whole episode on grief coaching, but basically I'm letting my client guide me. Where do you want to go? And how can I help you get there? So instead of diagnosing grief and ending it, we need to just allow people to feel their grief. I've said it time and time again, we do ourselves a complete disservice. And this is such a big part of our Western culture that we just avoid quote unquote bad feelings. There are no bad feelings or good feelings. There's feelings. There's emotions. They exist. They're not good or bad. It's how we react to them and how they affect us. And if we don't feel them, and we don't work with them, and we don't allow them to be within us, then we're closing that part of ourselves off. And if grief is love and we avoid it, we're avoiding love. We're avoiding expressing our love. There's just a couple more really good quotes in here that I want to read. Donna Sherman said, less than a month after the Sandy Hook school shooting, I was doing a group with some of the families, and one of the dads said to his brother-in-law, "Your relentless need to make me feel better is killing me. Go home. I need to feel bad. Let me feel bad." And that's part of grief. And as people who are outside of the grief, supporting somebody close to them who may have had a loss, and I've talked about what to say and what not to say to people who are grieving. Don't try to continually make them feel better. Let them feel bad. They need to feel that. They need to feel the quote unquote bad. They need to feel their grief. And telling them not to by telling them to distract themselves or just be happy, what you're doing is a disservice to them. You need to let them feel their emotions and be there for them. Kessler goes on to say, I believe as a field, we're trying to move from dealing with illness and diagnosis to dealing with prevention and mental health. Grief is part of being mentally healthy. It's part of the human experience. You're supposed to grieve. Well, let me read that last sentence again. It's part of the human experience. You're supposed to grieve. Whew. You're supposed to grieve, people. It's okay. It's okay to grieve. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to feel like crap. That's part of being a human being. Okay. I like I said, I'm going to link this article. Please go read it. There's so much more that I'm not even getting to, but there's just one more bit I want to kick on because it's the end of the article and it's kind of wrapping things up. And these are things I feel like I'm saying all the time. There are 3 takeaways that I would have. This is Kessler. 1, grief is natural and normal process. We need to normalize this expression of love. 2, this is big to me, clinicians need to continue to appreciate the power of bearing witness and not fixing. And 3, since we need to intervene for severe disruptions in life, I hope that this diagnosis will bring some resources with it without pathologizing the love that is the grief. That's second one, to continue to appreciate the power of bearing witness and not fixing. If there's anything you learn from any of my podcast episodes or anything I ever say to you, it's bearing witness and not fixing. Be with somebody. Be with them in their grief. Don't try to fix them. They are not broken. Oh, okay. This was kind of a heavy episode, I guess, sort of. I know I got very passionate here, but that's why I'm in this line of work that I'm in, because I'm very passionate about this. This is big. So I think you all know where my feelings are, where my opinions are. And if you disagree with them, that's fine. You absolutely have that right to have your own opinions on these matters. And I respect that. I always respect other people's opinions, even if I don't agree with them. Just as I would hope they would respect mine, even if they don't agree with me, right? Okay. As long as you're not being harmful to other people, you're allowed to believe what you like to believe. Okay. Whew! Let's all take a step back from that, take a breath. And let's move on to something a little lighter here. We're at the end of the episode, and I've got to read from the death deck. There's my my sound effect. That's not a sound effect, that's practical. All right, so I'm shuffling through. We're going to find a question, and hopefully it's a funny one or a good one. Okay, so I'm just going to be honest. I didn't pick one at random. I wanted to find a lighter card here to read after such a heavy discussion there. So this one's fun. It's called DIY. If you could plan your own celebration of life party, where would it take place and what would be the theme? So for me, I don't know the where it would take place. Probably I'd like it to be at my home, but my house and yard are kind of small. But I would love the theme to be being a kid again, because I really enjoy my playful side. When I turned 40, I bought a full-size trampoline for my backyard because I was never allowed to have one. And I love going to the kids museums where you get to play with stuff. I love that concept of being a kid again and just allowing yourself to have fun and be goofy and not take anything too seriously. I hate it when people take stuff too seriously. There's a time and a place, but my theme would just be, being a kid again. We would have ice cream and pizza and trampolines and bounce houses and ball pits. I keep saying I wanted to have a bounce house for my birthday, but my birthday's in late November. It's too cold to put one of those in the yard for a day. But yeah, that would be my celebration of life. I would want people to come and just let go, man. Just let go of societal norms and be a kid and be stupid and be goofy and have fun. That would be my celebration of life. So I'd love to hear about yours. Feel free to reach out through my website, nikkithedeathdoula.com. You can also email me. I'm nikkideathdoula@gmail.com. It's fine. Yeah, I'm on Instagram too, Nikki the Death Doula, if you want to check that out. All that stuff's in the show notes. Also, I have to say, please check me out on Patreon. Again, all the money I make from Patreon goes into a fund so that I can provide pro bono work to people who can't afford it. It's not going to my bounce house fund. If you want to give me a bounce house for my birthday or rent one for the day, I'd be all over that. All right. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, this is the last episode for a few weeks, so take care of yourself. Love yourself. Get a little self-care. Do something crazy and fun this week. Okay, guys? Thank you so much. Remember, grief is your own. Grief doesn't always have to suck. Good Grief was brought to you by me. You can find me online at nikkithedeathdoula.com. Today's episode was produced by me. Research and scripts written by me. Your host is me. Editing and sound design also me. Music is not me. Music is Cheery Monday by Kevin MacLeod. License information can be found at filmmusic.io/standard-license. Special thank you to my best friend and husband for constantly reassuring me that I don't suck.